I want it implemented on a thievery basis. God damn it, get in and get those files. Blow the safe and get it.
Where do Richard Nixon, Donald Trump, and the Pentagon Papers intersect? It's 1968. Johnson decides not to run for re-election. Mostly it's about Vietnam. And now the war is weighing down his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who's squaring off against Nixon. And Nixon is cruising in the polls. But weeks before the election, LBJ stops the bombing of North Vietnam. He gets Hanoi to agree to sit down and talk with Saigon. For the first time, peace looks possible. Humphrey's numbers rebound. He's gaining on Nixon. But then, 3 days before the election, South Vietnam President General Tu said his government would not attend the peace talks. At Nixon's behest, Anna Chennault, a representative of his campaign, had covertly told President Tu to stay away from the talks, that he'd get a better deal from Hanoi once Nixon was in the White House. LBJ got wind of this, suspecting Nixon of interfering with U.S. foreign policy, a violation of the Logan Act, making it a crime for any unauthorized person to negotiate with a foreign power to influence, undermine, or defeat a current U.S. administration's position. So Johnson called his friend, Republican Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, and he didn't mince words.
I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want to get this in the campaign.
That's right.
And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason.
I know.
And I think it would shock America if a principal candidate was playing with a source like this on a matter this important.
Yeah.
I know this, that they're contacting a foreign power in the middle of a war.
LBJ never went public with his suspicions, and Nixon beat Humphrey that November by an eyelash. Fast forward to 1971. The New York Times, and soon after the Washington Post, publish the Pentagon Papers, the focus of Steven Spielberg's latest movie, The Post. It's the story of Daniel Ellsberg leaking the Defense Department's classified history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam to the press. And while Nixon didn't mind his predecessors being placed in a bad light, he did fear leaks about his own Vietnam policy, both present and past.
Nixon was told that the safe at another think tank, the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., contained files that might reveal the secret role his campaign had played in torpedoing the peace talks on the eve of his election 3 years earlier, which President Johnson had then considered treason.
The president created a secret investigative unit within the White House that came to be known as the Plumbers. They broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. Later, they'd do the same thing to Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate. But in June of 1971,
Nixon wanted his plumbers to break into Brookings, crack the safe, and remove the files.
Did they get the Brookings Institute rated as way? Get it done. I want it done. I want the Brookings Institute say, please, out. And have it cleaned out in a way that they make somebody else will get.
The Brookings break-in would never take place, but Nixon's obsession with his enemies would be the undoing of his presidency.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
if Nixon had fought impeachment instead of resigning, would charges of violating the Logan Act and treason have become a factor in that impeachment? The Logan Act almost certainly is a factor in Robert Mueller's investigation. Michael Flynn's guilty plea alleges that a very senior member of the Trump transition team interfered with ongoing U.S. policy, matters involving Israel at the UN, and sanctions the Obama administration had placed on Russia. If a member of the Trump team interfered with or tried to persuade a foreign power to thwart the sitting president's foreign policy, a charge of treason for violating the Logan Act would not be unreasonable, and may now be causing President Trump some of the same discomfort that Richard Nixon felt back in 1971. For the American Law Journal, I'm Christopher Naughton.
We shall plan now.